Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jamie Pfister. I'm with the Federal Transit Administration. We're letting folks trickle in here. I see several participants, but we'll give it just another minute to let folks get in. Hopefully Zoom technology is working. And as a reminder, we are recording this so that folks can go back to it. And if you have colleagues who were unable to make it, they will also be able to access it. Hopefully everyone has gotten, you guys had got in without too much trouble through the registration process. Great. So we're hitting the masses. We were at about 50 folks, which is fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, my name is Jamie Pfister, and I have the pleasure of serving as FTA's Associate Administrator for the Office of Regional Services. What that means is I get to work with all 10 regional offices, which is really exciting. A few things we're going to cover today, just logistically, and then I'll just share a little bit more before we get to our speakers. But we're so excited to have you here. We know that our regions invited you all to participate because you have identified yourself or your organization as a potential new recipient, whether that's through a formula allocation or apportionment, a discretionary allocation. You're here hopefully trying to figure out how to navigate all the federal requirements to access those funds. And that's what our goal is going to be here today. So a few logistics. We are recording this. We will post it. I do also just want to kick off with a disclaimer. Oops, it went a little fast. Our lawyers like us to mention that there is actual law you should be paying attention to, all of our statutes and regulations for the applicable requirements. And we're going to try and explain some of those to you today. But this document and presentation does not have the force and effect of law. Our agenda for today, I'll do a little brief introduction of FTA and this series, which is a pilot. This is something we are trying out for the first time. And then we'll get into presentations from subject matter experts from our Chief Counsel's office, as well as our Office of Civil Rights. And then the best part is getting to that Q&A piece of the presentation, which is equally important and one that I actually hope you will use throughout today's session. So let's go over a couple Zoom mechanics as folks are still joining. We want you to use the Q&A tool versus the chat. The Q&A tool will let us make sure that we get to all the questions and answers. And if we are not able to get to everything during the at the end of the presentations when we open it up, then we will, and we'll have a moderator reading the questions to our panelists and then responding. We will try to do some in writing, but we will follow up for any questions that are unanswered. It is important too, there's so many different agencies probably represented here. I think we had over 40 distinct, maybe 50 distinct agencies. And so if you have something that's very specific to your project or your program that you're about to administer, the funds you're accessing, then it might not be a question everybody needs answered here in today's context, but go ahead and put it in the Q&A and we'll get you in touch with the right folks. So that's the Zoom mechanics. So before I introduce FTA, which is one of the modal administrations within the Department of Transportation, I just wanted to mention that how we got here in terms of this pilot. This is the first edition of a series of topics, and we'll talk more about that. But there's a number of reasons that FTA receives new recipients, whether it's new discretionary allocations. We have a lot of discretionary money under the bipartisan infrastructure law, our current authorization, that's resulting in new recipients. We just had the 2020 census, which is going to impact our formula apportionments. And we also have several subrecipients formerly of a state DOT that are now coming to us as direct recipients. So whether you're here today as part of a formula and trying to access the formula dollars allocated to your urbanized area, or you have a discretionary award, our hope with this pilot is to bring you some high-level information around prerequisites and some project requirements, applicable requirements. But there is no substitute whatsoever for the FTA staff and the subject matter experts that exist both in our regional offices and our headquarters offices. So I do anticipate follow-up and making sure that you are connecting with the right folks at the FTA regional level. So if you're brand new to FTA, we are a modal office within the U.S. Department of Transportation. We have political appointees, an administrator that's appointed by the President of the United States. And we have our headquarters office based here in Washington, D.C. And then I'll talk about our 10 regional offices that assist the states and territories. But our mission is about improving America's communities through public transportation. You see our vision and our values. Service, first and foremost, we are about delivering excellent service to our recipients and to those who need to understand the program requirements so that you can ultimately serve the riding public in your communities. So let's talk briefly about the regional offices. There are 10, and we've starred where the main offices are located, but thanks to a lot of technology, we actually have a lot of satellite offices, and we now have folks on the ground in Honolulu, to San Juan, Puerto Rico, in Arizona. So the stars just represent some of our larger offices. The other thing that I think that's great is 40% of FTA's workforce, and we are growing to a number of 700 here in the next couple weeks and months. 40% of our workforce is located in these regional offices. They truly are the face of FTA. They are the face of FTA across the country, enabling us to deliver our mission of improving America's communities through public transportation. So you're here today because our regional office invited you to be here to be part of our pilot, to give us feedback, to learn, to ask your questions, but also give us feedback of what are some of the areas that you need additional technical assistance in so that you can ultimately gain access to those federal dollars. It is certainly not a quick or easy process, but we will try to break it down for you in this 6-part series. So we're going to cover some prerequisites. Today, you'll hear from subject matter experts from our legal office to talk about legal capacity, which is a prerequisite to being able to receive federal funds. We will also talk about in future settings and future webinars, financial and technical capacity, also prerequisites. There are civil rights requirements that apply to all of our recipients or some of our recipients, different civil rights programs. There's also planning and environmental requirements that will be associated with your projects that are important to note before you can actually access the funds. There's systems access and grant making, and then eventually there's going to be reporting and compliance. Our colleagues in the Office of Safety and Oversight, who are responsible for the oversight programs, have also done a webinar series to help new recipients understand what will be evaluated in that ongoing reporting and compliance. And so these sessions focused on the prereqs as well as systems access and some of the early grant making requirements is intended to help you pre-award before you get that actual grant. So we will go through these topics over the next 6 weeks with you if you're able to dial in. I also just want to, we don't want to scare anyone with the requirements, but it is a process, and it's not as simple as the check is in the mail. So please bear with us and please stay with us over these next few weeks. We really appreciate you being here and willing to engage with us. So I mentioned the pilot in the series, the 6 parts, the range of topics, and the target audience, you all, is our new recipients, maybe a result of the census or discretionary programs. This is how we've broken out the 6 parts. And so today's is one of the longer sessions, but that's because we're tackling legal capacity and civil rights programs. And then in a couple of weeks, I hope you'll join us for financial and technical capacity, followed by some of the federal requirements that I mentioned, planning and environmental, and then the systems access, which folks must gain access to. So even if there's a formula apportionment you've received or a discretionary award, and maybe you submitted that application through grants.gov, there are other systems that all federal recipients of FTA funds do need to have access to. And so that is what will be covered in those sessions later in September. So without further ado, I do want to move on to our presentations with our subject matter experts. Jenna Lair is a regional counsel with the Federal Transit Administration, and she is going to walk through legal capacity, prerequisites, documents you need to understand why they're important in terms of gaining access to those grant awards. Followed by Jen, we'll hear from Marissa Appleton from our Office of Civil Rights. So Jen, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jamie. Welcome, everybody. I'm happy to be here today and to discuss the legal capacity prerequisites for becoming a new grant recipient. The topics that I'll be discussing today is I'll briefly run through the FTA prerequisites. Then I'll get into the specific documentation for legal capacity. It includes an opinion of counsel, authorizing resolution, certs and assurances, or certifications and assurances, also known as CNAs or certs and assurances. And for some of you, the designated recipient documentation will be required. As I discuss each documentation requirement, I will provide a few best practices to assist you as new recipients in understanding the requirements and compiling the necessary documentation to demonstrate legal capacity. As Jamie mentioned, there will also be an opportunity for Q&As after we finish both presentations today. If you think of any questions during my presentation, please input your questions in the Q&A. FTA prerequisites. The FTA prerequisites include, there are three prerequisites for an entity to be eligible for FTA funding: technical capacity, financial capacity, and legal capacity. As Jamie also mentioned, technical capacity and financial capacity will be discussed in a few weeks during one of these presentations. All of these prerequisites are intended to help new recipients and FTA ensure the funds will be spent in compliance with the requirements in FTA's authorizing legislation, regulations, and policy. These prerequisites are necessary because the uniform grant regulations require FTA conduct a risk evaluation before awarding grants to new recipients. Legal capacity. The legal capacity requirements specifically provide assurances that an applicant has the necessary authority under state or local law to request, receive, and spend FTA funds and to administer FTA-funded projects. These prerequisites also provide assurances that officials acting on behalf of the applicant or recipient have the appropriate authority designated by state or local law or by the entity's governing body to enter awards for financial assistance. An assessment of legal capacity is not only done when an entity is becoming a new recipient. Legal capacity is also assessed as part of FTA's oversight of established recipients. This latter situation is not the subject of today's presentation, however. I will only be discussing the legal capacity requirements applied when an entity is becoming a new recipient. So what is the required documentation? Grant recipients demonstrate an FTA determines their legal capacity through several documents. These documents include 1, the opinion of counsel, 2, an authorizing resolution, 3, the annual certifications and assurances, and in some instances, number 4, designated recipient documentation. FTA strongly encourages applicants to follow the templates linked in this presentation and found in the FTA circulars for Section 5307 and Section 5310 programs to ensure your documentation meets FTA requirements. You may notice when you link on open the samples that are linked in this presentation that some of these are almost a decade old, but these do represent FTA's current language recommendations. Also, the legal capacity documentation discussed today should be uploaded and maintained in the recipient documents portions of Trams. Another important point is that with the exception of the CNAs, the documentation required is generally intended to be a one-time submission. However, in some cases, updated documentation may need to be submitted to FTA. I will discuss the particulars of this when I discuss each document requirement. First up, the opinion of counsel. Each applicant must be legally empowered to request, receive, and spend FTA funds and administer FTA-funded projects. The opinion of counsel is intended to provide the assurances that a recipient is legally empowered. An opinion of counsel must be prepared by a recipient's counsel and must be approved by FTA before recipient's first grant application. It must contain the items listed on this slide, which are also included in the sample linked in the presentation. In certain circumstances, a new opinion of counsel could be necessary. As I mentioned, although the opinion of counsel is typically considered a one-time submission, there could be circumstances that necessitate a new submission. For example, a new opinion may be necessary if litigation or organizational restructuring would affect the validity of the content. FTA's regional councils review the opinion of counsels to ensure the relevant points identified in the slide are included. Please note, the legal authority cited for any of the points in the opinion of counsel should be attached. As a best practice, FTA recommends if you intend to deviate from the sample opinion of counsel in any way, it's a good idea to share a draft with the region to ensure it will satisfy FTA's requirements. Next up, the authorizing resolution. Each recipient organization must have a resolution from the recipient's governing body, for example, a board of directors or an equivalent authorizing official, which authorizes the official to undertake, and it could identify multiple officials, but authorizes an official to take the 3 actions identified on the slide. These include the submission of grant applications, the execution of the annual certs and assurances, and the execution of a grant award. The resolution must also include a commitment to complete the certs and assurances every year. The authorizing resolution must be submitted and approved before a recipient's first grant application. Although the resolution is generally intended to be a one-time filing, in certain situations, a new resolution could be required. For example, if there are changes to your organization's structure, a new submission could be necessary. The recipients must promptly advise FTA anytime there is a known change in the organizational structure in order to determine if there's the need for new documentation. As shown in the sample that's linked in this presentation, if an applicant is going to be requesting 5307 funds, the resolution must also state whether they are a designated recipient or whether they received authority from the designated recipient to apply for the Urban Area Formula Program Assistance. I'll briefly get into designated recipients in a later slide. Also, the technical and financial capacity presentation in a few weeks will provide very helpful additional information on designated recipients. A recipient may also need to submit a delegation of signature authority, known as a DSA, if the official identified in the authorizing resolution will not personally complete any of the required actions in Trams. For example, if the general manager of an organization is identified in an authorizing resolution, but the general manager will not personally certify the certs and assurances, for example, in Trams, a delegation of signature authority, a DSA, is used to authorize another official within the organization to take this action. This is just a matter of the flow of legal authority being clearly documented and provided to FTA. Another best practice, FTA recommends that if you intend to deviate from the sample authorizing resolution, it's a good idea to share that draft with the region to ensure it meets FTA requirements. The certifications and assurances. The certifications and assurances, forgive me, are an annual self-certification process. They are incorporated by reference and made part of every grant agreement. The certs and assurances are published annually by the FTA. After they are published, recipients must complete their certification in Trams before any grants can be awarded. When a recipient certifies in Trams, it's called pinning. What you will do is select the categories that apply to you and then provide the certification. As a best practice, FTA recommends the certs and assurances be completed by the official with the authority and the attorney. And FTA also recommends applicants select all of the provisions on the certs and assurances. You may ask whether this requires you to comply with the certs and assurances provisions that are not applicable to your organization, but rest assured, FTA will not enforce any provisions of the certs and assurances that do not apply to a recipient. So your organization will not be held responsible for any provision that is not applicable. Selecting all of the provisions ensures there will not be delays in the execution of a grant. Say if a recipient mistakenly misses an applicable provision of the certs and assurances. As discussed in the previous slide, if the official identified in the authorizing resolution will not personally certify the certs and assurances in Trams, there would need to be a delegation of signature authority, your DSA, authorizing the official that will complete this action in Trams. You should be aware also that around the time the annual certifications and assurances are published, FTA also publishes a master agreement. Like the certs and assurances, the master agreement is incorporated by reference and made part of every grant agreement. It is updated annually and enumerates the requirements that apply to any grant executed by a recipient. Although recipients do not have to take any action when the master agreement is published, FTA recommends as a best practice that recipients review the master agreement every year. Designated recipient documentation. Certain FTA assistance programs are apportioned to a designated recipient. These grant programs that this applies to include Section 5307 funds for urbanized area formula grants, Section 5310 funds, the Enhanced Mobility of Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities program, Section 5329 funds for state safety oversight grants, Section 5337 funds for the State of Good Repair grants, Section 5339, the Bus and Bus Facilities program formula funds. Designated recipients must demonstrate they have the legal authority to receive and apportion funds. This is accomplished through a designated recipient letter signed by the appropriate individual, usually the governor or sometimes another authorized person. This letter officially designates the applicant or new recipient as the designated recipient of the specified FTA funds. This letter also should be attached to the recipient's profile in Trams. Some of you, however, may expect to apply directly to FTA for funds that have not been directly allocated to your organization. The funds for which you are applying were likely sub-allocated to you, allowing you to apply directly to FTA for these funds. In this case, you would be known as a direct recipient. Direct recipients must submit documentation to FTA showing the sub-allocation of funds to it. The documentation authorizing a direct recipient to apply directly to FTA usually takes the form of a letter signed by the designated recipient authorizing the reallocation of the specific funding, for example, Section 5307 funds, to the direct recipient. The letter should also make clear that the direct recipient is responsible for submitting grant applications to FTA and is assuming the responsibilities associated with any award of such funds. Split letters are the mechanism by which designated recipients authorize a direct recipient to apply directly to FTA for funding. They're often prepared annually, therefore they may need to be submitted more than one time, but it will depend upon the circumstances of the reallocation of funds from the designated recipient. Again, FTA has a sample document for designated recipient documentation that is linked here on my slide. Now, I would like to turn it over to Marissa Appleton to talk to you about civil rights. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jen. Appreciate that. As mentioned, I am Marissa Appleton, and I will be your guide through today's civil rights portion of the webinar. We have a few objectives to get through today. First, we're going to discuss the FTA's Office of Civil Rights roles and responsibilities. Then we're going to discuss the Civil Rights Program submission requirements. We're also going to touch base on the 4 civil rights programs. And throughout the presentation, I'll be pointing out the different reference materials that you'll have access to as part of this presentation. So getting started, what does the Office of Civil Rights do? The FTA's Office of Civil Rights, which is also known as TCR, is responsible for ensuring public transit providers comply with all non-discrimination requirements. TCR provides technical assistance and training, conducts complaint investigations, and performs on-site compliance reviews to ensure that public transit providers fulfill the civil rights requirements. Who must submit civil rights programs to FTA? So we're going to go over bullet 1 first. Recipients identify which civil rights programs to apply for their agencies and submit all applicable programs prior to beginning an application in Trams and as a prerequisite to funding. Once the recipient has identified their civil rights program submissions, second bullet, TCR reviews the submitted programs to verify that they have been prepared according to the guidance. TCR receives a notification when the recipient submits a program to the Civil Rights Information section of the recipient profile. So I just want to make sure I'm going to highlight throughout the entire presentation today that the key word for the second bullet is submit. There is a submit button in Trams that does have to be selected in order for us to be notified of such a submission. If for some reason that submit button is not clicked by whoever submits the program on your end, then we won't get that notification, and this can cause some unnecessary delays. So if you hear me repeating the word submit throughout the presentation, it's just because if you don't remember anything else and you have to come back and reference the presentation, the one thing that I know for sure that you're going to remember after today is that you have to click the submit button. Third bullet, for initial vendor setups, a prospective applicant must be evaluated to determine what related civil rights programs are applicable, which depend on the type of organization and transit services. So it's really, really important in that first bullet that recipients accurately identify which programs are going to apply for civil rights and begin to work on those as early in the vendor setup process as possible, because if for some reason in steps 3 or 4 that gets overlooked, it could create some unnecessary delays when it comes to awarding a grant. And finally, bullet 4, the FTA regional office staff ensures that the recipient has completed and submitted the required civil rights programs and one-time documents as applicable before assigning a federal application ID number. So we work really closely in the Office of Civil Rights with the regional office to ensure that recipients are eligible for funding by submitting the required civil rights programs before we award or assign any application numbers so that you can begin your grant process. Why, when, and how do recipients submit civil rights programs to FTA? So first bullet, recipients demonstrate a basic compliance with and understanding of federal civil rights law by submitting civil rights programs and a DBE goal as applicable. Collectively, these are referred to as your civil rights programs before we award any grants. Now, I have mentioned the word Trams several times. That's our grants management system, and there's going to be an entire training just dedicated to Trams. So you don't have to know too much about it other than that it is a thing, and that's where your civil rights programs are going to go at this point. Second bullet, civil rights programs designate personnel and document the local policies and procedures that recipients are required to follow to accurately implement and carry out civil rights regulations. So the important statement here in bullet number 2 is implementation. You can have a beautifully written program and still be non-compliant with the requirements if you have failed to implement the strategies and the policies that have been identified in your program. So it's really, really important to make sure that you understand what you have committed your agency to in those programs and that you're documenting the implementation of those activities on a regular basis, so that when we come out for example, for an oversight review, that we're able to see that you are doing what you told us that you would do. Third bullet, the format and frequency of civil rights program submissions vary based on the statute, the regulation, and the recipient profile. As we go through the 4 civil rights programs, which is coming up next, I'll be sure to point out information about the format and frequency of those submissions, and each of those are a little bit different based on the program. And finally, fourth bullet, the civil rights programs are uploaded in Trams and submissions are documented in the civil rights information section of the the recipient profile. Again, keyword is submit. You want to make sure that you click the submit button when you are in Trams, uploading and transmitting your documentation to FTA. And we use this information in Trams to be sure if future opportunities like oversight to make sure that your submissions were transmitted to us timely. So what are the civil rights programs? We're going to touch base on 4 different programs today. The first is the Title VI of Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is also known as Title VI. Then we're going to look at the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program, which is commonly known as DBE. Then we're going to take a look at the Equal Employment Opportunity Program, or EEO. And last but not least, we'll take a look at the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which is commonly known as the ADA. So what is Title VI? By definition, Title VI requires that no person in the United States shall, on the grounds of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefit of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And the requirement for FTA recipients is that direct recipients, with very few exceptions, are required to submit a Title VI program to FTA via Trams once every 3 years. So what must be submitted for a Title VI program? There is our Title VI circular, which is 4702.1B. There is going to be a link to that resource very shortly. And this circular kind of provides guidance and explains what the different information must be included in the Title VI program that is submitted to FTA. So all recipients that are required to submit a Title VI program must address the Chapter 3 requirements, which are general requirements and guidelines. That would include the requirement to have a Title VI public notice, which informs the public of their rights under Title VI. This would also include the Title VI complaint process and form, and how you must advertise that to the public. There's also guidance on how to develop a public participation plan and a language assistance plan, as well as requirements for reporting on the demographics of governing bodies, as well as requirements for completing equity analysis when citing facilities. So those are the general requirements, and all recipients that meet the requirement to submit a Title VI program, again, must address the Chapter 3 requirements. Then there's the Chapter 4 requirements, which are specific to fixed route transit providers. And there is also increased reporting requirements for some agencies based on the fixed route fleet size and the size of the urbanized area. So specifically, Our larger transit agencies that are in urbanized areas of 200,000 persons or more, and that have 50 vehicles, fixed route vehicles operating during peak service, have increased reporting requirements and must provide some additional information, whereas our smaller transit agencies that are below those thresholds are not required to submit that information in their Title VI program. Then in Chapter 5, we have the requirements for our state DOTs. Chapter 6 includes the requirements for the Metropolitan Transportation Planning Organizations, or MPOs. And one thing to really take note of when we're talking about Title VI is that your program is required to be approved by your appropriate governing entity or your governing board before you submit it to FTA. So that is something we just want to point out that is highlighted also in Circular 4702.1b. As promised, here are a list of some of the resources that are available on our website in order to assist you with your Title VI program development. The first being our FTA Circular 4702.1b, and we also have some additional guidance for Title VI, and as well as a link for our training here. So next, we're going to touch base on the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise, or DBE program, which is DOT's program that seeks to ensure non-discrimination in the award and administration of DOT-assisted contracts in the department's highway, transit, and airport financial assistance programs. So basically, that just means that FTA is working alongside our sister agencies, FHWA and FAA, in order to implement the DBE program, whose objective is to create a level playing field on which DBEs can compete fairly for DOT-assisted contracts. There are a couple of two tiers of requirements here when it comes to DBE. So the first is that all FTA recipients must comply with DBE Transit Vehicle Manufacturer, or TVM, requirements when using FTA funds to purchase transit vehicles. This is really, really important, and I want to really highlight that all FTA recipients are required to comply with the TVM requirements, whether or not you meet the threshold to have a DBE program or goal. If you are using FTA funds in order to purchase vehicles, you must ensure that the TVM is eligible to bid on that project when using FTA funds. So the second tier is for recipients that meet the threshold to comply with the DBE requirements, and those agencies must submit information to FTA explaining how your agency will pursue participation of certified DBE firms on FTA-assisted contracts. And we're going to get a little bit more into the threshold for DBE in just a couple of slides. So again, we're going to highlight the requirements for transit vehicle manufacturers. So what are the requirements for transit vehicle manufacturers? First, want to point out that a transit vehicle includes, but is not limited to, buses, rail cars, trolleys, ferries, and any vehicles that are manufactured specifically for paratransit purposes. Again, it is important to remember that all recipients must ensure that a transit vehicle manufacturer has complied with the DBE requirements before you're accepting any bids. Also want to point out that we do have a list of eligible TVMs on FTA's website. There's going to be a list to that here in this presentation. A link to that list in today's presentation. And that list is updated whenever a TVM submits their DBE goal methodology to FTA. And another really important part of this requirement is that all recipients that use FTA funds to purchase a transit vehicle must report that procurement to FTA within 30 days of the contract award using the Transit Vehicle Award Reporting Form, which is also found on FTA's website and which will be available via that link. So next, we're going to talk about what must be submitted for DBE. So for the recipients that meet the threshold to have a DBE program and goal, and that threshold is that the recipient is receiving planning, capital, and/or operating assistance, and that the agency will award contracts exceeding $250,000 or more in a federal fiscal year, must submit in Trams a one-time DBE program that must be updated when there are significant changes. So unlike the Title VI program that must be submitted once every 3 years, your DBE program is not submitted on a regular cycle. However, after that initial submission, if there are any significant changes, then you must also submit an updated program. One of the things that we at FTA identify as a significant change is when there's a change to your DBE liaison officer or the staff that is designated to implement your DBE program. Some other examples could be updating or removing strategies that you're going to use in order to meet your DBE goal. In addition to the submission of the DBE program, recipients are also required to submit a DBE goal methodology once every 3 years that explains how the agency has calculated its overall DBE goal. In addition to the program and goal, recipients are required to complete semi-annual DBE uniform reports on June 1st and December 1st in Trams. And finally, for top 50 agencies, those recipients must submit a DBE shortfall analysis for each year that the overall DBE goal is not met. So one thing I would like to clarify here is that we do have a list of top 50 agencies on FTA's website that identifies which agencies we would be looking for shortfall analysis from in the event that they did not meet their threshold. But you would also be notified if you were a top 50 agency. For all agencies that are not a top 50, but that do meet the threshold to have a DBE program, you are still required to complete a DBE shortfall analysis for each year that the overall goal is not met, but you are not required to submit that analysis to FTA. Instead, what you're required to do is make sure that you maintain the analysis for at least 3 years to be reviewed at a future time at an oversight opportunity. So here's our list of DBE resources. I want to point out first and foremost that FTA does not have a circular for DBE. So we, in addition to FHWA and FAA, are all operating from 49 CFR Part 26. In addition to Part 26, we also have guidance as well as training on our website. As mentioned, there's the link to the TVM requirements, which will take you to the list of eligible TVMs, as well as the vehicle award reporting form. There's also a link to DOT-wide DBE guidance, and there's a really great link document, which is the tips for goal setting in the DBE program that is very helpful if you meet the threshold for DBE and have to submit a DBE goal. So now we're going to discuss what is EEO. EEO is the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as amended by the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972 and the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex for employment opportunities. And FTA's requirement for EEO is that recipients that meet the threshold to comply with EEO requirements must submit information to FTA explaining how the agency will ensure there is no discrimination in the employment process. So what must be submitted for EEO? Well, that depends on whether or not you meet the threshold to have a program, an abbreviated program, or whether you fall below the threshold. So the recipients that meet the threshold for a full EEO program must submit the program in Trams once every 4 years, and that threshold is 100 or more transit-related employees, and the recipient must have $1 million or more in FTA capital or operating assistance received in the previous federal fiscal year, or the receipt of planning funds in excess of $250,000. So recipients that don't meet the threshold for a full EEO program, but may meet or would meet the threshold for an abbreviated program are those agencies that have between 50 and 99 transit-related employees, and that would meet that 1 million or more in FTA capital or operating assistance threshold, or the $250,000 in planning funding. Again, only recipients that meet the threshold for a full EEO program are required to submit that program in Trams, submit. However, the recipients that meet the threshold for an abbreviated program are required to develop and implement the program and must maintain that information locally for review at an oversight opportunity. Here are our resources for EEO, which include our FTA's EEO Circular 4704.1A. This is a great update. It was done in 2016, I believe, and the one previous to that was in 1988. So it had been a good long while since we had updated the guidance, and there's a lot of really good information in terms of implementation and documentation as well throughout that circular. Also want to point out that we have EEO guidance as well as EEO training. And for any of our recipients that meet the threshold to complete either a full or abbreviated EEO program, strongly recommend you take a look at our sample practice charts. We have both a utilization analysis chart and an employment practices analysis chart, whether or not you would meet the threshold to have those. So certainly want to recommend that you take a look, and we strongly recommend that you would use those samples, as it includes all the required information and would complete the calculations necessary for those programs. And last but not least, we're going to talk about the Americans with Disability Act, or ADA. What is it? It is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which prohibits discrimination and ensures equal opportunity and access for persons with disabilities. So FTA's requirements for ADA are a little bit different from our other civil rights programs, in that recipients are not required to submit a program to FTA explaining how you will comply with the ADA requirements. However, recipients do commit to compliance with the DOT ADA regulations when you sign the FTA's annual certifications and assurances that Jen mentioned. So it's really important to keep that in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that this is something we take a really close look at when we do come out for our oversight opportunities. So you'll want to make sure that you're documenting your policies and procedures for how you're going to comply with ADA. So who must comply with the ADA requirements? Those requirements apply to pretty much all providers of transportation service, whether private or public, and whether or not the entity receives federal financial assistance. So even if you don't receive money from FTA, that does not negate the requirement that you must meet the ADA. We do have a FTA Circular 4710.1, which addresses and provides guidance on fixed route bus, complimentary paratransit, demand response service, rail in the form of rapid, light, and commuter, as well as guidance on water transportation and passenger ferries. So what ADA regulations are applicable to public transit providers? First, there's 49 CFR Part 37, which includes several subparts. Subpart A are the general requirements. Subpart B address the applicability of 49 CFR Part 37. Subpart C takes a look at transportation facility requirements, generally when it comes to constructing facilities or rehabilitating them. Additionally, Subpart D looks at the acquisition of accessible vehicles. Subpart F discusses the requirements for paratransit as a complement to fixed route service. Subpart G are the provisions of service. And Appendix D to Part 37 is supplemental guidance and is really, really helpful. There are a lot of examples in Appendix D, so it's a really helpful thing to take a look at as you're reviewing 49 CFR Part 37. Additionally, there's 49 CFR Part 38, which discusses design specifications, as well as 49 CFR Part 39, which specifically addresses passenger vessels. Here's our list of resources when it comes to ADA. Again, our FTA Circular 4710.1. We also have a link to the ADA regulations, the ADA guidance, and ADA training. And there's also a helpful link to the DOT's guidance, disability law guidance. So we have mentioned Trams a few times throughout the presentation. I'm just going to kind of remind everyone how that would look, understanding that you don't yet have access to Trams, but again, keep in mind that this is a presentation that you'll have access to later and you can come back. Generally, in order to get to the civil rights information in Trams, you would go to the Records tab. From there, you would select the recipient organization link, and then you would click on the recipient ID link. This would take you to a screen where you would see an option to click the related actions link, And from there, you would click civil rights. So you don't have to memorize this. Just remember that you have access to this information in your presentation. And once you've clicked on all those lovely things, it will take you to a screen that looks just like this, where it says Trams Transit Organization. That would be your agency's name, and the 4-digit number would be unique to your agency. However, it would bring you to a screen that looks just like this and summarizes your civil rights program statuses. So as you can see, there are roles for Title VI program, DBE goal, DBE program, and the EEO program. There's also a column that goes over the submission status, and that lets us know and you know whether or not a program has been submitted to FTA. Again, this is important. Unless you click the submit button, it is not going to show that it is submitted. So it is possible to upload but not submit a program, and that means that we don't know in the Office of Civil Rights that it is there. Similarly, the submitted date is affected by when you click that submission button. So you'll want to make sure again that you click the submit button, and then you can verify your submission by just taking a look at the submitted date. It should match the current date. Additionally, there's a column for the review date, and that just lets you know when FTA is taking a look at your program. And there are columns for the due date and expiration date. The due date identifies when your next program submission is due, and the expiration date lets you know when your current program will expire. So it's really important that there are staff at your agency that have access to and know how to find the civil rights information in Trams and can access this information and keep track. Again, this is the screen that we would also use to make sure that your submissions are on time. So for example, a Title VI program must be submitted once every 3 years. So here's where we would look to make sure that those submissions are occurring on time. We do have some resources for Trams. One of the things I want to point out as well is that in order to access Trams, do you need special privileges or permissions to have access to the civil rights programs? The answer is yes, you do. Someone at the recipient agency must have the civil rights user role assigned to your Trams profile. All users may have a view-only privileges and can view information about the civil rights program statuses, but only users that have been assigned the civil rights user role can actually submit programs. So usually if you're trying to submit a program and you don't see a submit button, your first indication that you don't have the appropriate access in Trams to do that. So it is also helpful to note that every recipient has a Trams user manager at their agency that would be able to assist you with creating an account and also assigning the civil rights user role. So it's going to be really important to make sure that the user manager works with all the different staff to ensure that they have the appropriate access. I recommend, while you should have at least one user that is assigned the civil rights user role, I always recommend that there be 2 in case somebody's out. Then someone else would be able to submit a civil rights program or a DBE report if need be. And finally, one last big reminder to please remember to click the submit button so that we are made aware of your program submission and we don't have any unnecessary delays. So here are the links to our resources for Trams. There is a user's guide, and chapter 4.4 goes over the civil rights management and explains how to submit civil rights programs as well as how to access the DBE reports. And there is additional guidance and training on our website. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Robert for our Q&A session.
Hey everyone, good afternoon. I'm Robert Hannafin with FTA, and I'm here to actually facilitate the questions and answers. We have received a few questions during the 2 presentations. Thank you again, Jen. It's a really great overview of the legal capacity, and Marissa for civil rights overview. So as a reminder to everyone, again, this is being recorded. The recording will go up on the FTA website. We're actually going to put the PDF version of this with all the links on the website as well. So don't worry about getting access to that. And then Jamie also dropped in the link to the FTA circulars. And then on top of that, we also, in the flyer that y'all had received as part of the notification of this event of the webinar series, we had a brief description of each webinar and the topics. And there are a few links in that as well, which are really helpful. It's just a high-level overview. So getting into the Q&A, got some good questions. First one is, how does the TVM requirement work if you contract out your service? And I think that was slide
That's me.
30. Yeah, sorry, do you want to just go for it?
Sure. So I'm happy to respond to that. So generally the TVM requirement still works the exact same. So you have to be an FTA recipient in order to receive FTA funding to purchase a transit vehicle. So if your agency receives funding to purchase a transit vehicle, regardless of whether or not that service is contracted out, you are required to comply with the TVM requirements. If for some reason your contractor is using funding other than FTA funding to purchase their vehicles, then they would be responsible for, if they're a direct recipient, then they would meet the responsibility to meet the TVM requirements. And if they're using some other type of funding, local private funding, then they're not required to comply. Only those transit vehicles that are purchased using FTA funds must comply with the transit vehicle manufacturer requirements. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you, Marissa. Another question. How does the grantee know what categories of the certs and assurances apply? Jen, this is for you.
Thank you, Robert. So as you will see when you review the certifications and assurances, not every provision will apply to every recipient or award. For example, there's a category that applies to recipients with fixed guideways. If you're a bus-only transit system, the provisions related to fixed guideway wouldn't apply to your systems. You'll see that generally the categories will depend upon the recipient's funding sources and planned activities. Reviewing the master agreement and the program circulars can assist recipients in determining which category applies. But as I said in my presentation, as a best practice, FTA recommends recipients consider selecting all of the categories in the certs and assurances because, as it's noted at the top of the certs and assurances, the FTA will not hold recipients responsible for any provisions that do not apply to its awards or activities. Similar language about FTA not holding recipients responsible for any provisions that do not apply is found in the master agreement as well. Selecting all of the categories will just expedite the review process for FTA staff, ensuring a grant application can be processed more expeditiously. However, if a grantee chooses to select not all of the categories, again, I would recommend reviewing the master agreement and program circulars to determine which apply. Also, as Jamie mentioned early on, the regional offices are just a tremendous wealth of information and support. So if you do have any questions on that, I think that they will be more familiar with both your funding sources and planned activities, which can help in determining which categories to apply or select.
Great, thank you, Jen. Next question, this is from Marissa again. And this was posed, I think, at the beginning of your presentation. What does a civil rights program look like? Is it a booklet, a resolution? And I think the idea behind this is like kind of how is this memorialized, not necessarily just in Trams, but how would this be memorialized maybe outside of Trams? Hopefully I'm piecing that together. And then also, do you have a sample?
Sure. So the civil rights program is going to look very different based on which program. So we talked about 4. So a Title VI program is going to look very different from a DBE program or from an EEO program. And then, of course, you have the policies and procedures for ADA are going to be a whole different thing based on those requirements. Generally, only the Title VI program requires a resolution, but it does also require narrative sections that respond to the circular to explain how you would comply with the different requirements. So we do not offer a sample. However, we do have sample information and guidance in the circulars, all of them, especially when we come to, for example, Title VI, there's an appendix, and there's a lot of different examples there. There is a template for DBE programs that is on DOT's website that's accessible through that link that I provided for the DOT guidance for DBE. But in general, we do not provide samples because your Title VI program or your DBE program or your EEO program is going to be very specific to your agency and the resources that you have in order to implement that. And so there is a very wide latitude when it comes to the different strategies that you can use and implement, and that may look very different from an agency that has dedicated civil rights staff when compared to an agency that has, say, 3 or 4 employees total, and those responsibilities have to be broken up. So it's certainly something that if you have specific questions on the program requirements and how to meet them, you should reach out to, we're going to have a contacts list, and certainly you can ask those questions. But we don't provide samples just because we want to make sure that your program is very, very specific to your agency and explains to us what we need to be looking for. And keeping in mind also that implementation is where compliance is really found. It's not just in the document itself, it's in the demonstration that you're doing the things that have been committed to in that program. So certainly if you have questions about the development of a program, please do let us know.
Great, thanks, Marissa. And actually on that note, I'll just take a quick second to just switch to this slide super quick on who do you contact with additional questions. So for legal capacity, definitely contact your regional office. They can put you in touch with the appropriate individual. Most regions have their own counsel. For civil rights, this is email address, and then specifically for this webinar series, again, kind of being hosted and facilitated by FTA's Office of Regional Services, please reach out to this URL. So that's who you would contact with follow-up. And Marissa, while I have you, where can folks find in-person or virtual trainings on civil rights programs?
Sure, great question. So the National Transit Institute, or NTI, has several courses for Title VI and ADA. They also have a course on DBE, but I haven't seen it running lately. So there's a link, I believe, that should also be included in the presentation, and it's also accessible by our website to take you to the list. And NTI provides trainings not just on civil rights, but on a plethora of different transit requirements. So it's definitely a handy resource that you would want to check out.
Great, thanks. Then going back over to you, how would an agency complete and submit a DSA form for certs and assurances?
Thanks, Robert. A delegation of signature authority, what you would do is you would identify the individual or position that's going to receive the authority to take action in Trams, and you would have it signed by the official identified in the authorizing resolution, and you would just upload it into Trams into your recipient documents. The link to the sample document will show you what you would want that to contain. Actually, the delegation of signature authority may not have been on there, but we can get that to you. A sample of a delegation of signature authority. It simply needs to denote what authorities are being transferred from the individual or official identified in the authorizing resolution to another individual. So the breakdown of those roles would be: number 1, the submission of grant applications; 2, execution or certification of the certs and assurances; and 3, execution of the award, the grant award.
Great. Marissa, does the Title VI implementation plan need to be signed by City Council?
Sure. So generally, the requirement is that the appropriate governing official, which is the officials that are responsible for policy decisions, are the ones that have to sign. So it could be a board resolution, it could be meeting minutes. There have been instances where I've seen a mayor sign the resolution. So it just really depends on your local agency and how that's set up.
Yeah, and the question was posed, I believe, from the city of Alexandria and Dash. we can definitely follow up with
It
Region
is not
3 just to
uncommon for the
confirm.
city council to be in a city setting, but you just want to make sure that this is the actual body that has the decision-making ability.
Great, thank you. Jen, let's see. If my organization applies to FTA for funds, would we need a designated recipient letter? Jen, you're unmuted.
Apologies, I'm so sorry. I was having a technical challenge. So in answer to that question, it depends. A designated recipient is defined. It's defined by federal law at 49 USC 5302. Although the term direct recipient is not defined in FTA's authorizing statute, certain funding programs will allow for funds to be provided directly to entities other than a designated recipient. For example, Section 5310 includes the definition of recipient and subrecipient in Section 5310 that only apply to that section, meaning they only apply to the 5310 program funds. Specifically, the 5310 definition of recipient includes a designated recipient and a state, local governmental entity that operates public transportation service. This means entities that are not designated recipients may apply directly to FTA for 5310 funds. Section 5310 also identifies subrecipient as an entity that receives 5310 funds indirectly through a recipient, so they would be receiving funds as a subrecipient instead of as a direct recipient. These definitions distinguish Section 5310 in terms of who can apply directly to FTA for funds. And it allows entities that are not direct recipients to apply directly to FTA for funds. In most instances, an individual or an entity will know if they're designated recipient because that authority will be provided to the organization by the governor or another authorized official. Sometimes it can be the head of the state DOT. But if you have a question specifically as to your organization, I would encourage you to request confirmation from the FTA regional office within which you fall.
Great, thank you. Jamie, I'll put you on the spot for this question. As a new direct recipient, when will our agency be held to all FTA regulations and responsibilities? At what point in time does that happen? Is it when you're active in Trams, are you drawing down funds, et cetera?
Great. Good question. And not that this is the best response, but it will depend, right? So access to Trams is just access to a system in which you then enter a grant application. But as we've gone through today, there has to be some verification of these prerequisites. And typically we would give systems access when that verification has been done. So Jen's walked through a number of different documents that come in. The regional council and regional team would look at them, assuming they're sufficient. We'd move kind of to the next gate. We're going to talk in a week or two about technical and financial capacity. There's some documents that come in, and then there's forms obviously to gain access. But gaining access to Trams is just one of the systems we'll actually talk about. Where the grantees request that reimbursement is through another system, a financial interface system with our financial management systems, and that's what we'll talk about with ECHO, the electronic clearinghouse. And I'm so glad you asked the question of how do you get reimbursed, or how do you, when can you begin drawing down funds? Because I wanted to make the point that we reimburse expenses that have been incurred in accordance with the programs and the requirements. So in terms of, it's kind of a difficult question to answer fully, but I do think once you've been granted access and then you begin to enter the grant application, which will need to go through a regional review and award process, and you have access to ECHO. At that point, then you may likely be granted that green light for expending funds. But there is a concept that we're not covering today called pre-award authority that's very specific to certain programs. So you may actually be incurring some eligible expenses potentially, that you then seek reimbursement for. So thanks for putting me on the spot. I'm not sure I answered that as clearly as you would have liked, but we are happy to follow up with your organization to figure out exactly what program funds we're talking about and if you've met some of these requirements. But, the award of the funds comes in Trams. And that is another process in itself of preparing the grant application for which you will ultimately expend funds in accordance with and seek reimbursement for through that ECHO program. So we're going to hold you accountable, throughout the process for these prerequisites, these other requirements. And then again, something that we only touched on slightly here, we visit our 5307 recipients on a triennial basis and do oversight reviews, and on an annual basis you are certifying to us that you are compliant, and those were those CNAs that Jen covered. So great question, a little complicated to explain, but we're happy to follow up with you.
Great, thanks, Amy. Actually, at this point, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions yet, but I did want to just really quickly, as a request, completely voluntary, we have 2 poll questions related to just the webinar and the content material presented today. And it'd be really helpful. Again, this is a pilot initiative. We haven't done this before, at a global, national level for new recipients. So, and this is the very first one. It's the first of 6 different webinars we're going to be doing. So we're just trying to gauge, whether this content was suitable, adequate, like whether it improved your learning. So these are completely anonymous. Again, voluntary as well. There's just 2 questions. So I'm going to just launch these polls. And if you could fill them out, that would be great. Again, just 2 questions, and I'll read it out loud. Today's presentations improve your understanding of these topics. You have 3 options. Yes, greatly improved. Yes, slightly improved. No, did not improve. And then the second one is, did today's presentations provide an adequate level of information and detail as an introduction to these topics? So the answer is just yes, level of detail was good, basically, or no, the webinar did not provide enough information, or no, the webinar provided too much information or detail. And again, this feedback's really helpful for us to kind of improve, refine the curriculum, and just to better understand the range of needs. I know that everyone's coming in maybe different levels of experience working with FTA or really DOT. And so we obviously want to cater that to all the different types of audiences and experiences. And I'll give you all maybe another 20 seconds to answer this. And then we did get one more question. Yes, I thought we did. It looks like it disappeared.
Robert, it was whether or not any of the sessions are going to talk about pre-award authority, and I'll just note.
Oh, okay.
We will cover some of the basic prerequisites to pre-award authority, but pre-award authority is really dependent on the program we're talking about. Discretionary programs carry a different pre-award authority than, say, formula funds. But when we get into the planning requirements and the environmental requirements associated with your project, those are obviously significant prerequisites to having any sort of pre-award authority. But again, it's going to be dependent on the type of funding that you're applying for. And we have to follow the trail back to the statute and the regulations that grant us the pre-award authority. So again, formula funds and competitive funds, or discretionary funds, which are often competitive, very different rules. So we can connect you with the right regional team too.
Hey, I do have one more question right now. This looks like for Jen. Must my organization submit certs and assurances even if my organization is not making an application for FTA in the current fiscal year?
Thank you. So the answer to that is no. If you submit applications infrequently or every few years or just not in a particular year, and you would not need to submit a new certification. So if you are not submitting an application in the current fiscal year, you would not be required to submit a new certification. But if you anticipate applying for a grant for FTA funds, you do need to submit a certification that fiscal year.
Great, thanks. Thanks for clarifying that. Oh, there's some more. Sorry, that came in. Can you further discuss the requirement that opinion of counsel be submitted? A specific element of that.
Sure. So when we say submitted, that could involve that you send it to a point of contact at the region for review and confirmation that it meets FTA requirements. And then it would be uploaded into the recipient documents in Trams. There will be a session on Trams in this pilot, which will assist with some of these understandings of the interface of Trams. But basically what the recipient documents is just essentially like a virtual file folder of all the recipient documents that are required every time in order to apply for and be eligible to receive grant funding. And I think that answers, I don't know that answers the question. If you have something additional in terms of the question that's been asked, please do let us know.
Alrighty, looks like I don't have any other questions. Again, just to thanks again, everyone, for participating today. The panelists, the hosts on the FTA side, and we had a number of folks join in from the regions themselves, as well as all the new recipients. Oh, sorry, another question. On what subject should new recipients counsel opine? And that's a follow-up to Jen's response.
So I would encourage you to look at the sample that FTA has provided. And then also the points on the presentation and the bullets. The intent is for the presentation to be a resource for you in terms of what is required and what the content needs to be. But basically, the opinion of counsel is really intended to show that an entity is, and document that an entity is legally empowered to receive FTA funds. So I would say that specifically what it needs to, the opinion of counsel needs to contain, as it's noted on the slide, is citations and quotes from the legal authority, which authorizes the applicant or recipient to provide and assist transportation. So this would be under state or local law. Citations to the legal authority that authorizes the applicant to provide the local share. That may be a local ordinance, for example. A statement that the attorney has reviewed federal, state, and local laws, and there's no legal impediment to them applying for federal funds or pending litigation. Also, if the applicant or recipient will be applying for 5307 funds, the opinion of counsel must also include a statement that the applicant is a designated recipient, or a statement that the applicant received authority from the designated recipient to apply for and receive 5307 funds. Please do let us know if you have further follow-on questions.
Thanks. These are all really, really great questions. Okay, well, I guess we can wrap it up. Again, everyone, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. This is being recorded. We will post the actual recording of this webinar to the FTA website, and we'll send out the link. There have been a few links and reference materials dropped into the chat. In addition, there's going to be the actual PDF that's going to be posted, the PDF of this presentation, and it'll have all of the web links, so you can just directly click on those to access the different circulars or other reference materials or web pages throughout the FTA website. The FTA website is just generally a great repository of information. And I just further want to reiterate, FTA, both folks in headquarters and subject matter experts, and in the region specifically, we are here to help assist and provide guidance to you all in terms of just getting you onboarded as a new FTA recipient. We're really excited to be working with you all, and you truly are partners to delivering the FTA mission. Really, we can't do it without you. So, Jamie, I don't know if you want to end it. Anything else you'd like to say?
Just thank you again to all of our participants, our panelists, and to the team of folks here at FTA to help deliver this. We look forward to seeing you back here for the next session as well.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice afternoon.